Dr. Yohann White, who is doing cutting-edge research on HIV as well as leukemia, has studied in Jamaica, Britain, France, and the United States. He tells his story on Profile. Welcome. I'm Ian Boyne. Yohann, from third year at medical school at the university, you came to international attention because of the research that you had done. Let's start there. Talk about that research you had done in the third year.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me, Mr. Boyne. It's a real honor being here. In the third year of my medical school, I had an interest in looking at children with HIV. And I learned of a group that was on the university campus that was conducting research. And I approached them and said, I have an interest in doing this. I met somebody who was very motivated and had a good track record in research, who was willing to mentor me. And I said, I could focus on this aspect of the research, looking at how children take their medications or keep up with their medications.
With their medication?
Right, because that wasn't being done.
As HIV patients?
As patients with HIV. What was being focused on was the clinical aspects and, growth and taking medications, like the right medications and so on. But what wasn't being focused on were the factors and social factors that impacted how children were able to take their medications or being impeded from taking their medications. And so my mentor became interested. I, designed a study. The first one that I designed didn't quite make the match. There were a few pages, and somebody on the team said, this is a little bit light. We have to spend a lot of time building research projects. And so I did it over, and I went back, and I said, okay, let's go. And I wrote a protocol. I did the interviews with the families, the parents, the guardians, as well as the children. And that resulted in...
And you published?
We published. So at first we presented at the university's annual research conference. And there were about 4 awards available that year, and we were able to cop 3 out of the 4, including the, Dean's Award.
Yes, I see.
Young Investigator Award. And that propelled us towards publication. It was also presented a couple times by my mentors in the US for a physicians group who were focusing on adherence or sticking to medications, as well as an international conference in Toronto.
And that study has been quoted all over the world?
Yes, because it's an important topic, especially for developing countries who don't have much in terms of resources, in terms of second-line medications. So if you do fail, or the first set of medications do not work for the patient, you have to go to a second-line medication, a backup medication, which is more expensive. Yes. So sticking to the medications in the first instance is very critical.
And let us explain to viewers, Yohann, what would be the particular challenges of children with HIV taking their medication?
Right.
We're talking about stigma. You're talking about the children are taking the medication so regularly. People are going to, the classmates are going to ask, what are you taking this medication for? Right. Explain to us the particular challenges.
So going into that study, one, I thought, based on my literature review and my own thinking about the idea, you would expect that maybe children wouldn't like taking their medications because of the taste,
yes,
or the smell, or becoming upset or nauseated.
Those are the regular reasons.
But to our surprise, it was related to the fact that parents couldn't just leave their children with relatives and leave the medications. They had to. That disrupted how children took their medications because you couldn't leave the medications. At school, you have to be careful because, to be seen taking the medications every day, 3 times a day, it draws attention. That is beginning to change, and there's a lot of progress that has happened in our society. Yes. But that pulled my attention to a very important thing about the way we practice medicine. A lot of it doesn't have to do with the biology or the physiology of the condition that you're dealing with. It's really the social aspects and the human aspects of medicine that can make a very big difference.
And you have focused a lot on that. You have done significant work with the LGBT community, LGBT issues, focusing on a sexual minority engages with health issues. Tell us about some of that work.
Yes. So having worked on HIV, for example, I became aware that there are also other groups who were vulnerable to getting HIV. Their risk was different. But it's not just HIV. There are other conditions where social groups, because they're marginalized or pushed to the fringes of society, they don't do as well as other people in the population. In the U.S., for example, it would be racial minorities.
True.
Why do they have higher blood pressure than everybody else and higher rates of diabetes?
Yes.
What's the difference? Physiologically,
It's not just physiological.
right, you're pretty much the same as anybody else. But
Yes.
having to deal with that stress on a daily level, it takes, it takes it burdens you, and it takes away your energy and your strength, and you're more likely to have a stress response and to develop these conditions. So in a country like the United States, for example, it would be racial minorities.
Yes.
In the Middle East, it might be a religious minority. So we call this concept minority health or minority stress.
Or minorities.
In Jamaica, I think one of the most
It's cool.
notable groups that would undergo that kind of stigma and discrimination would be sexual minorities, for example. And so it was a topic that attracted me, and it's not a sexy topic, it's not a popular topic, and that has never really stopped me from taking on an issue. So I became even more interested. Nobody wants to do it, it needs to be done, I'll do it. It wasn't a requirement for my curriculum. I was still in medical school studying.
So it was outside of the curriculum?
It was outside of the curriculum.
But you had this
But
interest?
it never felt like work.
Yes.
And being able to build rapport with the community itself around this issue as to why there's this increased stress directed towards this group, and what's the impact? It really grates on your coping strategies. It grates on your strength. But interestingly, what I found in that study is that persons who experience some kind of a displacement from their families or rejection from their families or communities were the ones who were more at risk for depression or psychological problems, psychiatric problems. But those persons who still were able to maintain some rapport with their families did better. But what was also interesting...
better health outcomes.
Yes. What was also interesting in that study is that depression, for example, was commonplace. Like in the past month leading up to the study, maybe half of the respondents had, they met clinical criteria for being depressed. And when you look back over a lifetime period, maybe 2/3 to 80% of them met clinical criteria for being depressed. That's very high. In addition to that, though, one of the surprising things that came out of that study is that not everybody was depressed. So even though you're in an environment where you're tolerating this kind of a stress, some persons had resilience and stamina. So what could we learn from these individuals that could help you to design programs and interventions that could help the rest of the group?
Yes.
So those were
And what came out? What were some of the factors, the resiliency factors which came out?
That led me into a second study, actually a follow-up study to that, which I published, I think, last year in collaboration with a colleague from Columbia University. So that study raised the issue that there was something that was protective. We could see risk factors. One of them that stood out was relationships with your family. That was the biggest. So persons would be at 10 times risk for depression, for example, compared to those who did not face that sort of rejection from their families. So the study that we did following up to that, which was published in the International Journal of Sexual Health, was focusing on family relationships. So this time the entire study moved to that, which we published last year. So social aspects and the social interaction with the rest of society, the way society treats certain groups, it really does have an impact on your prospects and your health, your well-being.
Yes. And your main area has been immunology.
Yes, and that's interesting because in the same way that in medical school you have a fixed curriculum, and I did that very well, but it wasn't really enough, which was what got me involved into life. Real life. What do people experience outside of the physiology? But at the same time, I'm also a scientist, and I like natural sciences. I like immunology. I like the way the immune system is made up, which is how your body protects you from germs and foreign invasion by germs, for example. that fascinates me, and I had the opportunity to deepen my knowledge in a field that I like very much.
When you come back, I want to talk about the important work you did in Japan. You went to Japan to do the PhD.
Right.
So you not only have the medical degree, but you have the PhD in medicine. A highly accomplished medical scientist, Dr. Yohann White. We take our first break on Profile.